Welcome. In the next 3 lessons, we're going to be exploring our next method that we want to examine. It is the rhetorical method of criticism developed by Chaim Perelman and Lucie Olbrechts-Tyteca. It's sometimes referred to simply as the new rhetoric. It's called the new rhetoric because, as we'll see, Perelman and Olbrechts-Tyteca anchor their understanding into an old form of rhetoric, but they update that old form with new insights and new perspectives. So it's called the new rhetoric. If we're going to understand the new rhetoric, we want to take on the idea that there are certain key issues, and we're going to look at 3 particular key issues in the new rhetoric that we want to examine in greater depth in the next lessons. The first is the audience. The new rhetoric has a very specific and very universal view of the rhetorical audience that it wants you to combine and carry forward. And that very special view of audience is one of the defining qualities of the new rhetoric, and it will require a really close look. In addition to the idea of audience, there is a term that they use called adherence. The new rhetoric focuses especially on this idea of adherence in order to distinguish and to explain how the new rhetoric differs from other kinds of thought and other kinds of argument. And so the new rhetoric focuses on and picks up this idea of adherence. Again, a very technical term. It'll be a little tricky when we get to it. It's subdivided into 2 major categories and each of the 2 major categories is subdivided into 3 other categories, all of which are really valuable and all of which are really important to understand how it is that the new rhetoric actually functions. So the new rhetoric will be what we'll be looking at in terms of adherence as well as audience. And finally, the third primary category, the key issue in the new rhetoric, is something known as justice. You've got to come to see justice as the root of Perelman's rhetorical approach, okay? Justice asks the question to which the new rhetoric is attempting a response. Okay, this last element of these 3 key issues in Perelman, it also helps to account for what is really a very pragmatic focus in the new rhetoric. It's very concrete, and the idea of the new rhetoric is really focused on specificity and functionality out there in the real world. It wants to be willing and able to make a difference. All right. So we're going to be looking at each of these 3 ideas: justice, adherence, and the audience. And as we explore them, we're going to be taking a deeper dive into the idea of the new rhetoric. We're going to start with justice. So let's begin there with the idea of justice and begin to figure out how justice figures into Perelman's and Olbrechts-Tyteca's idea of how rhetoric functions. When we turn our attention to justice, we have to focus on the fact that Perelman is, when he begins to write about justice, and he's writing about justice at the end of World War II, he is an eyewitness to the kinds of difficulties, the kinds of ethical horrors that take place in World War II. He knows how bad people can be toward one another, both on a mass scale and on an individual scale. He is simply rooted profoundly in the fact that human beings can do horrible, horrible things to one another, and can be not only just massively, socially, culturally cold and cruel, but can also be very personally, very privately mean and petty and vicious. So he's confronted with this deep, what appears to be a deep universal flaw in the human experience, psychology, soul, call it whatever you want. Somehow there's a brokenness, an indefensible lack of focus in the way human beings live out their lives. That's what he takes as his foundation. And he begins to say, given this brokenness, how in the world are we going to fix it? How can we make the world more just? Given the horrors and the terrors, what can we do how can we define, what should we think in order to bring more justice into the world? Now, Perelman's first work is a book called The Idea of Justice, which he publishes in 1945, right at the end of World War II. And in this, he proposes the idea of justice. He gives a definition to justice. He says, formal justice is when beings of the same essential category, the same kind, I mean, essential categories, are treated the same way. That's the definition of justice. That formal definition that he provides to us in 1945 is his beginning point. It's where he starts. It was, however, difficult to apply, right? Because that sort of formal kind of technical definition seemed pretty thin in the face of the kind of real world suffering that he has just been through. So this is Perelman's first step, and he will tell us years later, even in this first step, I'm deeply unsatisfied. Here's one of the reasons he's unsatisfied. I want to read you just a brief cutting from Perelman's work on the idea of justice. He says this. He says, we are thus led to distinguish three elements in justice. So justice has got three aspects, three elements. The value that is its foundation, the rule that sets it out, and the act that gives it effect. Now, those are the three elements of justice. But then he goes on to say this very, very disturbing thing. He says, as for the value that is the foundation of justice, so value is the foundation of justice, as for that, we cannot subject it to any rational criterion. It is utterly arbitrary and logically indeterminate. It's not connected. Justice is not connected to the way we can think about the world. It's somehow a completely arbitrary construction. Okay, so if that definition, now he comes along and in 1970, so this is written in 1945, what I just read you, 1945. By 1970, he's developed, along with his colleague Olbrechts-Tyteca, the New Rhetoric. And in 1970, he comments on the New Rhetoric. And one of the things he says in that commentary is that even when he wrote the 1945 book, he was very disturbed by having to write what he thought was an absolutely damning critique of his own ideas of justice. It was damning because if values are arbitrary, then justice, the very definition of justice, has to be something arbitrary. In other words, his definition in the face of real world activity seemed pretty flawed. His definition was in fact flawed, okay? And he knows it from the very beginning. His instincts, his intuitions at least, tell him in 1945, man, something's wrong with this. And of course, you know, it is flawed. In fact, if you have been paying attention to these lessons, you ought to be able to give a pretty good account of not only that it's flawed, but of how it is flawed, all right? Perelman knew that all the factuality, all the groups of things that could be proven to be so, all the is that were out there could be established. But he wanted something else. He wanted an ought. He didn't want to just simply have a cold scientific report of things that were happening, because what was happening was horrible. But there was no way to say what was happening was horrible. You ought to stop that kind of horrible behavior unless you brought something to that cold factuality from outside. So the pure mathematical, absolute scientific reasoning that led to knowing all the things we knew, that wasn't enough. And you had to bring something to it from the outside. Perelman knew he had to bring in a value from outside of pure knowledge. Okay, that's great. But he has already concluded that that value is pretty thin and not really very valuable. Why? Because, as he himself observes, it's utterly arbitrary. It's utterly arbitrary. And that arbitrary aspect of justice was the very thing he was trying to avoid. He didn't want to arrive at a place where justice was arbitrarily decided. Now, why? Why was he trying to avoid that? Okay. Why was he trying to avoid arbitrary value? Well, he was trying to avoid it for a very good reason. because he had watched arbitrary morals being applied in the real world, and the result was horrifying. Okay, what he realized is that by his definition, if all beings of the same essential category have to be treated the same way, if that's the definition of justice, and if values are utterly arbitrary, values are going to be mixed up in our definition of how we're going to establish criteria for defining groups. So guess what? It becomes perfectly fine under his own ideas of justice to create a definition of the essential category of human being that leaves out somebody, that excludes somebody like, oh, I don't know, Jews, for example, Africans, Catholics, left-handed people. It doesn't matter. If our values are absolutely arbitrary, if we're going to just make them up, okay, on our own terms, well, then guess what? The Nazis can make up values that define a human being in a way that cuts out Jews or gypsies or gays or any other group in the whole wide world that they want to exclude. That wasn't a solution. That was the problem. This arbitrary course of values, this situation where, that's what he's trying to shut down. This ability to create an arbitrary definition of real human beings that exclude some people. He wants to stop that. He wants to be able to look at that and say, no, that ought not to happen with some authority. Okay, he doesn't want to look at that and say, well, I don't like that. He wants to look at it and say, no, that's wrong. He can't do that if values are simply arbitrary. He has no way to look at the intense suffering that was brought about by the horrors of World War II and say, no, that ought not to happen. He can't do that if values are utterly arbitrary. So he's trapped, he's stuck. And that's what he explains in 1970. When he wrote that article in 1945, that text in 1945, and he begins to work on his idea of what is justice, well, that's where he keeps coming up short. He can't find any way to short circuit what he knows, feels, believes, thinks, needs to be cut off. And that was the problem that set him on his course of action. That sets Perelman on a quest, all right? And that quest is to search out values and reasoning and see how they are related, to try and figure out what's going on. In fact, what he really wants is values with reasons. Okay, that's what he's after. He wants to somehow put together reason and value. He's trying to avoid the is-ought problem. He's trying to find a way to connect ises and oughts with values, but he doesn't want the values to simply be an arbitrary choice made by a group of people. He wants to found them somehow in all universal human thought, and he doesn't know how to do that. But as he searches, as he sets out on this quest, that leads him to raise a really intriguing question. And he says, okay, in the past, other cultures didn't seem to have this problem quite so often or quite so profoundly as we have it. What was happening? How did they deal with this? How did they work through it? How did they work around it? What was going on? And that, as he begins to explore, and as he begins to say, what is it that other cultures have done? Maybe they've done something and we've missed it. And that is what leads Perelman and later Olbrechts-Tyteca to inquiries about rhetoric, the old system of rhetoric. They pick up this, and what they begin to discover is that, oh, wait a minute. There's an entire system for thinking about things that you cannot absolutely prove. In other words, there's a way to link up human experience, human reasoning with choices about values in our aesthetics, in our politics. There's a way to link those together with human reason. Granted, you can't get to absolute proof, of course not, but you don't make arbitrary moral choices. You make choices that are rooted in reason, and the lights go off. And the realization is suddenly there, there is a way to do this. At least there were people who in the past argued that there was a way to do this. And it seems to be a way that would skirt the problem that has been given to us by the modern world. The problem that says conviction, faith, trust, confidence based on good reasons, not just bravado, not just arbitrary choice like, hey, I've decided I'm better than you. No. Confidence is built in giving reasons that somebody else says, well, hey, those are some pretty good reasons, but you haven't really thought about this. And you have to go, no, honestly, if I'm going to be honest, no, I hadn't thought about that. Let's talk about that. How important is that? Where should it go? And suddenly this ability to create discourse, to engage in discussion about values that is not arbitrary. It's not just picking one and trying to champion, hey, yay for my team. Perelman sees that it is possible for pistis, for conviction, confidence, faith in, trust, that those things can be rooted in a scope of human reason and human experience, even though it does not result in absolute knowledge. Okay, that complex idea, which we have outlined, sketched out, explored, the idea of enthymematic reasoning, of giving good reasons that are going to get you somewhere that you can't prove, but that is well reinforced, right? It's got supports under it. That process is one that they crack open and they begin to try and work with it inside the old ancient idea of rhetoric. The concept of pistis then becomes one that they capture under another term. And they begin to talk about pistis, confidence, as an aspect of the human experience that is called adherence. Now, adherence means something very, very like pistis. It means a sort of confidence, a conviction, a trust that you've got something here that's really valuable, worthwhile, and relevant, okay? That's adherence. Valuable, worthwhile, relevant. That's adherence. And that begins to be the way they will start to crack open and to expand the sort of ideas that they want to bring into discussing how people can reason and reasonably discuss things like values, political choices, human relationships, religious confidences. How can we discuss all of those? How do we bring all of those in and support them and still have a broad spectrum of different perspectives and different views? Let's talk about that. That's what they're going to focus on when they get to the idea of adherence in the new rhetoric. Okay, adherence, you'll remember, of course, is the second of those terms that are core to the key ideas of the new rhetoric. Justice was the first, adherence is the second. So we are now ready in the next lesson to take up the idea of rhetorical adherence inside the idea of the new rhetoric. That's where we're going next.